Welcome. This is episode 8 of our series entitled Luke is a Legitimate Non-Pauline Gospel History. I think if you've seen episodes 1 through 7, you know that there is a lot of meat to studying Luke and realizing he is teaching the same thing that was in Matthew, and there's good reason. We've reviewed things as about, for example, that Luke is a translation of the Hebrew Matthew that was being kept in Caesarea at the time Luke is translating it, and that was just outside of Jerusalem, about 70 miles. So he is probably working under the auspices of the 12, and the reason he's writing to Theophilus a copy of his translation of the Hebrew Matthew, and he's doing the book of Acts, is to try to exonerate Paul at an upcoming trial. And that Paul appealed to Nero, and as a result, there's going to be a trial in front of Nero whether Paul is responsible for his friend Trophimus violating the temple by entering in an uncircumcised state beyond what's called the middle wall of separation. So that's what this is all about. It's something that our Christian teachers don't normally teach us, so we need to get out of the clouds and get down into what was really going on in Luke, in his gospel, and in the book of Acts. And we'll see it's not to promote Paul. It may look that way if you don't know the context. And that's why the book of Acts is contradictory of Paul, because it's not designed to vindicate his epistles, and it appears that maybe Luke didn't even know anything about his epistles or his true doctrine. He was just trying to take what he knew and present it as well as possible to win an acquittal for Paul at this trial. The entire church depended upon this victory, because if Paul's acts were deemed to show Christianity was this radical new sect, then we would not enjoy Roman legality, using the legality that the Judaism already had established for centuries with respect to Rome, and they tolerated them because they were a tolerable religion. They had values that Rome could accept and didn't think was going to be upsetting to their own theology of their gods at Mount Olympus. Okay, so with that said, now we're going to dive back into what is going to be episode 8, another exciting review of Luke's Gospel. Okay, so another parallel that Luke has to a statement against the Pharisees exists in Luke, similar to what we see in Matthew 23, verse 23. So let's review what Matthew said. In Matthew, the Pharisees are depicted as tithers who fail to follow any other portion of the law. Okay? But by the way, don't you think it's ironic that the only message that the Protestant anti-law group ever gives in their churches is to try to make people feel guilty and pay a tithe, and they actually use those words, tithing. So they're in favor of tithing, but every other command of God is wiped out. And that's exactly what Jesus criticized in Matthew 23, verse 23. Just stunning. But anyway, what we're trying to show you is that Luke is completely in line with that. So Luke 11, verses 42 to 44 in the KJV. We similarly read a very negative statement about the Pharisees' position on the law, as they emphasized only the law of tithing on food, which they evidently benefited from. So in the old days, the Levitical priests could go around your house and make sure that you were giving 10% of your crops. And if you were, they were entitled to it. Okay? They were entitled to a portion of your 10%. They didn't get all of your tithe. It had to be distributed equally between widows, orphans, Gentiles, and themselves. By the way, because the Gentiles were an object of the tithe, we were considered poor by definition as a class. We were not subject to the tithe, and so I have a whole article on the tithe, and maybe I'll provide that so people will understand what their obligations are. And I believe our obligation is to help the poor, but it's not defined by the law of the tithe that was imposed upon the sons of Israel. So just so you understand that. But you know what? We'll have to do another separate video on that. All right. Anyway, so here's what it's in Luke. It's going to sound very similar, but it's somewhat different. But woe unto you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs. So they would go into people's gardens and say, hey, you're growing this mint, rue, and herbs, and we want 10%. And Jesus is basically saying, you go to this level. He's not really saying it's the best thing to be doing, like you're wasting time. These are just herbs, but he doesn't say they're wrong either. So he's just saying you go to this length. And then he says, but you pass over, you ignore, you do not teach judgment. What's judgment? Principles of right and wrong, judging what is the correct thing to do in any particular circumstance. And the law has a lot of that to it. You pass over judgment and the love of God. These ought you to have done, and not to leave the other undone. So this is another reference to the love of God message. In where do we see that? It's in the principle about detecting false prophets, apostates who come to you with signs and wonders, and God allows them to exist. People like Paul. I'm going to be honest with you. That's who he is. He's a test from God to see if you love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul. That's in Deuteronomy 13, 1-10. It's called the law of apostasy, and it has this specific command to love God with your whole heart and soul. Okay? So this is something the Pharisees won't teach. They won't teach about false prophets who come with signs and wonders, and yet are trying to draw you away from keeping the law, because what do the Pharisees do? Jesus says you draw people away from following the law. You only teach them tithing. Okay, that's all you do. But you don't even teach the love of God, which is another commandment of the God's law. All right, so that's just commenting on the first half of verse 42. Verse 42 continues, these ought you to have done, and not leave the other undone. Okay, so they have not done these things. They've not done judgment. They've not done. Wait, let me see. Oh, okay. I think in context he's saying, yes, you should have done these tithing of the mint and rue, but you've left undone these other things, which is teaching the judgments of God and the love of God. So that's very similar to Matthew, except Matthew has three things. Matthew has judgment, mercy, and pistis, which can be either faithfulness, or the word obedience is the same word as faithfulness, or it could be faith. Okay. Then the next verse, 43. Woe unto you, Pharisees, for you love the uppermost seats in the synagogues and greetings in the markets. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are as graves which appear not, and the men that walk over them are not aware of them. So they're like the walking dead. It's kind of a strange thing for Jesus to say, and I'm not sure I'm aware of what he was trying to say there, but I can just tell it wasn't positive. So they're not teaching God's law properly, teaching, frankly, a minor provision, the tithing command, to the sons of Israel. I mean, it's not minor, but it's just like, what's more important, the love of God, the judgments? What if you tithe 10%, but you just never love God, and you don't do any of the judgments, you don't follow any of the commands of God that are for right and wrong? I mean, it's just like tithing is too easy to do, frankly. It's just take 10% of whatever you make and you put it over here, you give it to the priest, and you're done. It has, I mean, it's an important social requirement that God had, but it doesn't match judgments of God and the love of God. So anyway, so accordingly, Luke's gospel is not only non-Pauline, it is clearly contrary to the epistles of Paul time and time again. Because what is Jesus saying? Follow the law, the commandment about loving God. Okay, again, the doctrine of the apostates has this principle in there. Jesus calls it the most important principle in the Bible. The number one command was to be fulfilled by you detecting false prophets. Think about that. So would you be surprised that the New Testament would have a challenge for you to figure out there could be a false prophet in our midst? and I don't even think it's too obvious, but somehow it's been missed by a huge amount of people. So it wasn't as obvious as you would think. Anyway, let's see. I think we're going to move to another slide. Let's just see. And Luke's gospel is uniformly derogatory about Pharisees for traits Paul himself evinces in his epistles, such as Paul denouncing the law generally, while Paul cites portions of the law to argue in favor of financial support for those who minister to himself. Okay, yeah. So let me just say this. The Pharisees were assuming or taking over the role of Levitical priests. They would come into people's homes and say, hey, you owe 10% on your herb garden, okay? And Levitical priests could do that too. They were supposed to come, they could come to your home and seek to collect the tithe. Okay, so the Pharisees were taking the same function away, in a sense, from the priests and doing that. Okay, but notice what's happening is they're trying to support themselves because they're allowed by the law itself. Whoever collected that tithe as a priest could take 10% of that tithe. So the Levitical priests were entitled to 10% of the tenth of the tithe. Okay, so that's what's going on. There's a financial self-interest in the Pharisees going to your home and getting your herbs and all that from you, and they're going to take their own cut. And Jesus is basically highlighting their hypocrisy. They only care about the tithing because it puts money or benefits in their pocket. And we see, if you look at what Paul does and how he treats the law, he ignores all the law and tells you don't follow it except one command. He commands you to follow Deuteronomy 25 verse 4. I call it Paul's self-serving use of the law to urge support for preachers and teachers. He says this command about not letting an ox, God has a command to not muzzle your ox while you're treading out the corn in the field, so that the ox can eat from the grass that it's treading while you're controlling your beast, your oxen. And Paul says that was God doesn't care. Does God really care for animals? No, this was altogether meant for our benefit, because it tells us that when we sow to you, our flock, we are allowed to reap from you profit, meaning gain. We're allowed to make money off you. Which what did Jesus say? No way. He said, freely you gave, freely you were given, freely you must give. And he basically prohibits them in this is in Matthew chapter 10, I believe it is. Yes, chapter 10. He prohibits the apostles from taking any money for preaching and teaching. But what he does say, you can ask to go stay at someone's home, and under the law of hospitality, under the Mosaic law, a person should take you in if they can. And then if you are in their home, you had a duty to try to help the house, clean the house, go take care of the farm animals. Guests had to make themselves valuable. But then the law also said if they've done something beyond just ordinary guest activity, and they're literally becoming part of your daily workload shifter, they're taking over a lot of your workload, you then had to pay them. And the way you could paraphrase that law was called the worker is worthy of his wage. And that's how the Jewish people understood the law of hospitality, gave rise to the workers worthy of his wage. So Jesus is saying the only way the apostles could promote themselves financially is to become a guest in someone's home, take advantage of the law of hospitality, and become a worker in the person's home and make a wage, and you are now a worthy of his wage. And you can see Paul doesn't want that. You don't want to work in anyone's home. You want to just simply say, I have a right to payment. And this passage about an oxen is all about us ministers. We get money from you without having to do anything in your home. Just hand over the cash, just like as the Pharisees came into people's home and said, hand over your rue, your mint, and your spices, and we're going to take our cut of that. So it's just a very similar hypocrisy, if you ask me. Thus, the Paul of the epistles would be destroyed by reading Luke's gospel as a comparison to what Paul teaches. But it is obvious the Paul depicted in Acts has none of those traits viewable only in Paul's epistles. So in other words, Luke is not seeing any of the doctrines of Paul while he's in his presence with Paul, and is then summarizing in the book of Acts those things that Paul says and does. They don't have anything that contradict Jesus that Luke is recording in the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke. And therein lies an interesting issue of why did Luke not know of the epistolary Paul? How, or more importantly, why did Paul not expose Luke to Paul's true doctrines that he shared with his trusted followers in the epistles? A good question. So we're going to go into that in another slide. So I'm going to just stop right here, and we'll be right back. Okay, so next heading, Acts. Luke was still ignorant on the epistolary doctrines of Paul. So what we're going to prove to you is that one of the reasons why Luke is unabashedly pro-Paul is not just the strategy he has to win a trial in front of Nero, but it apparently is an honest ignorance of Paul's true doctrines. Let's see if that theory bears out when we read. Luke's Acts is designed to make Paul look good in light of what Jesus taught in Luke's gospel. So if you're a Theophilus, you're seeing the values of Jesus, and you're seeing values of Paul that completely match Jesus. So let me prove this point to you. Thus, Paul in Acts is law obedient when requested by James in Acts 21. Remember that? So he says to Paul, I've heard that you're an apostate, that you're guilty of apostasia. This is in the Greek, hidden away from you, that you can't see that. And then he tells Paul, you can prove to everyone that you're not an apostate by taking these several men, paying their charges to perform the Nazirite vow at the temple, and that'll prove to everyone that you are not abandoning the law given Moses, and we will put to silence all those bad talkers about you. And Paul does this. And so as far as if you were Theophilus and you're a pagan, you're saying that this Paul is not a renegade. You can see he acted properly. He did exactly what his leadership told him to do to quell this challenge that you were an apostate, which in Roman eyes, if you had an apostate within Christianity trying to lead it, that could be a ground to hold the whole group is what? Illegal and not to be approved because they're not in control of their leaderships or people who are assuming some important roles, such as Paul was. Okay, next, Paul endorses the law in Acts 24:14. Where does he say that? In 24, verse 14, Paul says, get this, I believe in all things that are according to the law and prophets. Now that sounds like he's saying, I believe in everything that's written in the law and prophets. Now there is a little ambiguity. This word in Greek is kata, according to the law and prophets. I believe in all things that are according to the law and prophets. Well, if you had this secret view that the word according means only those things I accept that are consistent with the law and prophets that I believe are the law and prophets, then you may have a private reservation in using that term. So that could have been what's really going on in Luke, but Luke doesn't see that because on the surface, this statement sounds like you're believing in all things that are according to the law and prophets, and you don't have any mental reservation about it, okay? Next, and Luke quotes Paul saying in court, under oath, before the Sanhedrin, that he has lived in all good conscience, that is without sin before God till this day. That's Acts 23:1. So again, Luke would have a complete understanding that Paul has been a law-adherent person his entire life, and therefore he wouldn't have changed. Becoming a Christian would make you less law-adherent. Well, Luke has no idea that Paul is claiming exactly that. Because by becoming a Christian, he's learned that I don't have to follow the law at all. Okay, and there's no more Jew, which means Paul is no longer a Jew. He can live exactly like a Gentile, and he's breaking no law anymore, right? Okay, but Luke doesn't know this. Paul was claiming to be a righteous person his entire life, as righteous as knowingly possible. Paul twice in Acts shortly thereafter affirms the continued validity of the law on two independent issues. Bet you haven't seen this before. When Paul claims in a religious court not to recognize the high priest was the one who ordered Paul struck in the face for lying, even though the high priest's garments are unique in 8 different ways. So there's no way he didn't know that was the high priest, but he's going to claim, I didn't know it was the high priest. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to insult you. Paul then reviles the high priest as a whitewashed wall, a urinal wall, okay? So by the way, Paul has a lot of gentle language, and he talks about, he wishes the circumcision party in Galatia is trying to make the Galatians think they need to get circumcised to participate in Passover or go enter the temple. He says he wishes they would just castrate themselves. I mean, so the very graphic language. Here he uses extremely insulting language. He calls the high priest a urinal wall, which is you'd use whitewash on these walls to get rid of the smell of urine. And that's what he calls them. Disgusting. Disgusting. The lowest class person would do that, right? But that's who Paul is, just so we are completely aware. And then he curses the high priest, and he says, God will strike you. Acts 23, verse 3. This leads to Paul twice affirming the Torah in Luke's hearing. Wow. Twice he's going to affirm the Torah as true, still true to that day. First, Paul affirms that the high priest ordered Paul struck contrary to the law. So Paul is saying, you can't do that. You have not held the trial in which I've been found to have lied. Okay? So Paul is correct. The high priest acted prematurely. Just got angry and ordered Paul struck. There is no legal sanction for the high priest to have done this. The high priest did so because he was incredulous that Paul had lived in all good conscience his entire life up to that time. It could be that the high priest actually had personal knowledge. We don't know. So maybe we can't judge the high priest. But Paul is claiming, in essence, the high priest, you don't know me. You can't judge me at this time. So we'll take Paul's side on this one. And what is he saying? You violated the law. And indeed, the law would be you can't punish someone until they've been tried with 2 witnesses. And even here, the high priest being only a single witness would not be an adequate person to deliver a penalty or punishment of the law, which would be slapping you in the face. So Paul was correct, and he's invoking the Mosaic Law incident. Okay. Now let's just see, what's this point? Incidentally, the likely reason the high priest knew of the event where Paul had James, the brother of Jesus, and the bishop of Jerusalem. Okay, so I actually put in here, I think the high priest remembered. There is the fact that Paul, in his pre-Damascus Road experience, had the brother of Jesus, also known as the bishop of Jerusalem, and the Jews highly regarded James the Just. You have to understand, there were traditions independent of Christian documents that showed that James the Just had a special license by the Jewish people to enter the temple and officiate as if he were a priest, as if he were a Levite, even though he's from the tribe of Judah. And it said so. It's even though he was from the tribe of Judah, he was considered so holy by all the Jewish people, they would even allow him to go in and act the role of the high priest. You have to know that people didn't like the high priest in those days because they were appointed by Rome. Herod had controlled all this. So somebody who's really righteous like James would be said, they'd welcome him in. You know what? Please do the high priest officiation today for us. We don't like the high priest. So this is sort of something that's a subtext that we don't know about James the Just. So he was just that holy. And this is the man that Paul drives up the stairs of the temple and then throws him off the temple, the ledge at the top of the temple. So he's going down 15, 16 feet to the ground, probably, had some broken bones or whatever. And then Paul left him for dead. That's how the Clementine recognitions puts it. But he doesn't die. So this is maybe what the high priest is thinking about, that this was the same Paul he knew threw James down, severely injuring him. So that could be why. But still, obviously there would have been numerous witnesses, but the high priest is not allowed to do this without a true trial. So Paul is correct. He's invoking the Mosaic Law to criticize the high priest. So even though the high priest was technically correct that Paul was lying, that he'd lived in all good conscience, Paul himself participated in the murder of Stephen in Acts 7. And another reason is we know that Paul participated in the murder of Stephen in Acts 7 without a formal charge. So this was done without court proceedings at all. Just simply out in the open, group of guys pick up some rocks with Paul's instigation, and Paul grabs their garments and they start throwing rocks and eventually kill through stoning Stephen, who's known as Stephen the Martyr. And then the high priest also knew that Paul was guilty of attempted murder on Bishop James by throwing him off the temple portico ledge. So, but Paul still was correct. It's not lawful to strike an accused in court for perceived lying. All right. So Paul properly cited the law or Torah as applicable to protect himself. And Luke is listening to this. So if you're listening to Paul and he's invoking the law to rebut the high priest's actions, you would have to assume that Paul is saying, I, Paul, believe in the law given Moses as valid and binding between you and me, Mr. High Priest. Okay? So there, Paul is not claiming that the law had been loosed between the husband, God, and his wife, Israel, or brought to an end, as he taught in Romans 7, verses 1 to 7. The second time, Paul does the same thing. Paul then affirms in the same passage of Acts that Luke is recording, a second time in Acts 23, when Paul loosely quotes the Torah law, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. He says this in Acts 23, verse 4. The verse is Exodus 22, verses 28, and correctly says, you shall not revile God or curse a ruler of your people. Paul first spoke evil of the high priest as a whitewashed wall, right? So that's like a curse on him. This is a urinal wall, dusted white to reduce the odor. Then Paul cursed him by saying, God will smite you. So that's a real curse for sure. Paul, when asked, do you revile the high priest, then admits his words would violate the law, but then excused himself because I did not know the one giving the order was the high priest. Thus, Paul twice affirms in Acts 23 the law, the same law which he said was loosed between Israel and its husband in Romans 7, 1 to 7. The reaffirmation by Paul twice in Acts 23 of the Mosaic law obviously led Paul again to further assume Paul treats the law with an ongoing validity, just as Jesus taught in Luke 16. So, but we who know the epistles of Paul know that he is what? Lying. He doesn't believe in the law. He's citing it to the high priest in total hypocrisy, because if you could read his letters, which already have been written, the letters to the Galatians have already been written by the time of Acts 23 for many years earlier, okay? He's already written not only Galatians, Thessalonians, he's also written 1 Corinthians, I believe. That's what it is. And he may not have done Romans yet. So that's all it's... So he's got the second half of his career coming up. But he has written against the law already. And in Galatians chapter 3, he's very clear that he claims that Moses did not get the law from God himself. He got it from angels. And then he tells the Galatians who want to observe the Sabbath, or what he calls days, he tells them, why do you want to do that and be in bondage to those who are, quote, no gods? Meaning, if you're obeying Sabbath, that comes down to the I think it's the sixth commandment of the 10 commandments. And Paul is saying, why do you want to be in bondage again to the weak and beggarly elements, these angels who are no gods? And so he is literally denying the complete validity of the law, and he's done that prior to this time when he's citing the law twice, once to defend himself, and the second when he's accused of doing something wrong. He then quotes the Mosaic law as still applicable, but excuses himself, not because he claims the law was never given to God by Moses, as he says to the Galatians, but now he's claiming that he did not know it was the high priest, which is preposterous, because the high priest has 7 distinct things on his garments that only he's allowed to wear, and one of them is this big thing on his forehead that says holiness belongs to the Lord, something like that. And Paul claims he worked for the high priest for many, many years in his persecution of Christians. So he must have met the high priest, must have noticed that only one person in the world wears all these garment items, and he must have known the high priest in that court that day was who was talking to him and calling Paul a liar. Yet Paul says, I didn't know it was the high priest. I'm sorry I called him a urinal wall. I'm sorry I cursed him to God. Okay, so, so many other problems about that. But the key takeaway here is Luke doesn't get this impression. He's being told, he's listening to Paul, and Paul is affirming the law twice in Acts 23. Thus, clearly, Luke did not know the contrary epistolary doctrines of Paul, with which we are all familiar. Paul teaches, what does he teach? The law is dead, Romans 7, 1 to 7. And thus it is all past tense. Paul also believes that not one is righteous, Romans 3:10. If Luke knew that, would Luke truly depict Paul as saying he lived in all good conscience his entire life up to that point of Acts 23:1? Of course not, because Paul would be lying, because Paul doesn't believe anyone's righteous. So how can Paul give testimony that I've lived righteously my entire life? So Luke, why would Luke do that? It's embarrassing to have Paul contradicting the very thing he's testifying in a court of law. So Luke does not know of Paul's epistles. That's the only thing that makes sense. And then let's see how I address this. Thus, if Luke did know of these contradictions and wished to remain loyal to Paul, Luke would not write a gospel or even Acts so damaging to Paul, revealing contradiction after contradiction of how Paul spoke in front of Luke and how Paul spoke in his epistles. So really, if he's going to promote Paul to Nero to try to win a trial, he would have to consider the risk that if Paul's epistles are circulating, they could have gotten back to Nero by the time of the trial, and Luke would be looking like he's a complete liar himself, because everything he's saying that Paul's saying in court contradict the very words of Paul in these epistles. So that's another reason why. I mean, Luke's going to put his neck out, right? But he doesn't want to lie to Nero. So Luke has you could be killed yourself. Nero's a vicious person. So if Luke really knew of the epistles and how contradictory they are of these statements of Paul, for example, in Acts 23, he wouldn't take that risk. You just, you know what? I'll leave that story out. That would be what you would do, rather than have Paul say things that contradict his own statements in his epistles. That makes sense. You wouldn't want to take a risk that Nero's going to take it out on you, Luke, and you're now the liar, and you're going to go to court. And I think there's a death penalty under Roman law for lying. So, I mean, it's a very severe thing. Okay, and then evangelical scholar R.B. Brackman acknowledged this fact long ago. For Luke portrays Jesus in Luke's gospel as having doctrine that is antithetical to Paul, whom Luke is trying to portray favorably in Acts. Certainly, Luke was unaware Paul's epistles taught abrogation of the law. Otherwise, if Luke knew this, Luke would not have wished to open up Paul for ridicule and giving false testimony by recording rather than ignoring, just simply ignore these things. That Paul says the following in Acts 24, verse 14, in the courtroom with Felix. Okay, so this is going to be another bruiser here of lying by Paul. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way which they call sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law that is written, and everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. Now, you see, actually, this is what I was trying to say to you earlier. Notice the difference. He believes in everything that is in accordance with the law, which means I believe everything that is consistent with the law. But notice he then believes everything that is written in the prophets. So actually what he's saying is, this is what I think he's saying. I believe everything written in the prophets is true. So that he's giving a complete 100% pass. But the law, he speaks different. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law. That doesn't mean everything in the law is written by God, or I believe everything written in the law is correct. He's saying everything that's in accordance or consistent with the law, I believe. So he may have a private meaning there that is everything that is inconsistent with the law I don't believe in. And then when you ultimately learn that he teaches the law was not even given by Moses, what I think it was given by God to Moses, what I believe he could be privately thinking is, I don't believe the law. I mean, the law says that God gave the law. The law, Exodus, has God, Yahweh, giving the law to Moses. But Paul is claiming, maybe based on a, quote, revelation from his, quote, Jesus, that the law was given by angels, because there is no tradition in Judaism that the law was given by angels and instead of Yahweh, okay? None. Where is Paul getting this from? Let's assume he's getting it from these private revelations of his Jesus, which I believe is the phony Jesus, an apostle, an imposter. Okay, that's my view. You may disagree, but clearly Paul is teaching in Galatians chapter 3 that the law was not given to Moses by Yahweh, and it was instead given by angels. Where did he get that from? Well, he didn't get it from the Bible. He didn't get it from Pharisaic doctrine. He didn't get it from any doctrines anywhere in any Targums or commentaries or anything. So it has to come from another source, and it's likely his revelations from his Jesus. Okay, and therefore this statement, in accordance with the law, would be the only thing I'm going to accept from the law is those things that I know are consistent with my Jesus, that are in accordance with the law, and that would be I'm going to privately reserve my mind about the law itself. The law was not given to given to Moses by God. So this is a very interesting. I had never really focused in on the difference. He believes everything written in the prophets, but he does not believe in everything written in the law. If you really look carefully what the construction of that sentence is, very interesting. This is a very crafty person. He thinks about what he's saying. But I don't think Luke is as crafty as Paul. But I think what you also are seeing is Luke is very careful to just record those things that are said. I bet you he is taking notes. I believe he was an attorney. I think he was a doctor of laws, not a doctor of medicine. And somehow that got it was mistaken that he was a doctor of medicine. He was a doctor of laws, and that's why he was hired by the church to defend us in this trial upcoming with Nero. All right, but let's continue. In context, Paul was being charged with letting an uncircumcised Gentile enter a temple area where the uncircumcised were not permitted. Paul was trying to imply to Felix he would obey the law and prophets and would not have violated the command against an uncircumcised Gentile entering the temple proper. That command happens to be a command most clearly stated in Ezekiel, a prophet. Okay, so when he says, I believe in all things that are written in the prophets, he is therefore affirming that a Gentile cannot enter the temple without being circumcised, because that's in Ezekiel. Thus, had Luke known or heard that Paul testified that he believed in all parts of the law and prophets before Felix, implying Paul felt obligated to follow the law and prophets, but Luke had read Paul's epistles that speak to the contrary, Luke would know that Acts 24:14 would lead to ridicule of Paul as untruthful. So why include this statement? Why include this statement? I believe everything that's in accordance with the law and is written in the prophets. It would only prove embarrassing. So don't include that. Nero could end up finding out that this is a false statement by Paul in front of another Roman magistrate. Don't include it. So the only correct inference is that Luke does not know that Paul contradicts these statements in Galatians chapter 3, where he says the law was not even given by Yahweh to Moses. It was given by angels who are no gods and are weak and beggarly elements. And why did the Galatians want to be in bondage again to those weak and beggarly elements? And we're going to close up here, and I think this will be the last part of this episode. So I'm going to just read this off here and make comment. Because Luke's agenda to portray Paul favorably in Acts is self-evident, it follows that Luke could not have known the epistolary works of Paul say, I am not under the law, and Christ was the end of the law. This is all in Romans 7:1-7. Indeed, how could Luke include Paul's contrary testimony before Felix if Luke knew of all of Paul's epistles? For had Luke known of the epistles of Paul, then clearly Acts 24, verse 14 would prove Paul was testifying in an untruthful manner in front of Felix, saying, I believe everything that is in accordance with law and that is written in the prophets. Paul certainly was implying to Felix that he, Paul, was duty-bound to obey both, which Paul's epistles make clear that Paul does not believe that to be true. So in other words, by including this statement of Paul in repeating to Nero that Paul had made a statement in court that could be demonstratively be proved false by just pulling out Galatians chapter 3, would lead to a second charge against Paul being brought in trial at Rome, and that would be for perjury in front of Agrippa and Felix, I think it's here, Felix. And I think Agrippa was involved in the same hearing. It was a joint hearing between two Roman officers, I think. But anyway, so Nero could go after Paul for perjury against him out of what Luke is recording happens in front of Felix. And do you think that Luke would actually expose his client, Paul, to more prosecution instead of less prosecution? He thinks he's adding this in to show Paul is what? A normative Jew who follows the law and who believes the prophets were legitimately written by the prophets. Okay. So I think we're done here. I think you can see that there's a lot going on when you're studying Luke and reading the book of Acts. Luke is very pro-law. Luke is very much portraying Paul as pro-law, taking all his two statements in the encounter with the high priest that he affirmed. Paul quotes the law, affirms the law, and then it takes this statement in front of Felix where Paul clearly testifies that he believes in all things according to the law and written in the prophets. Now, you and I, we know there's something else going on here, and we could convict Paul of perjury in front of Felix if it were tried today, because we have Galatians chapter 3. Luke did not have that, nor did Nero at Rome have that, apparently, and that's why Luke gets acquitted in That's why Paul gets acquitted in this trial in front of Nero, this trial that's going to come up right after the book of Acts is finished, about 2 years later. Okay, everyone, I'm going to end this episode 8. This is episode 7. I'm going to end it here, and we'll pick up with episode 8. Look for a little message that you can get this next video through the playlist. All right, God bless. Take care, everybody. Ciao.